Hello, good evening, and welcome everybody to this ISPI roundtable on Europe-Africa. What chance for the EU new strategy? My name is Giovanni Carbone. I'm head of the Africa program at ISPI, and I will moderate the discussion. I would like to welcome in particular our four speakers, Karim El Ainaoui, president of the Policy Center for the New South, Giovanni Faleg, senior analyst at the European Union Institute for Security Studies, Paul Simon Hendy, Senior Regional Advisor at the Institute for Security Studies, Geert Laporte, Director at the European Think Tanks Group. Thank you all for accepting our invitation to contribute to our debate tonight. The way we'll go about addressing the issues we want to talk about tonight, we'll have two rounds of interventions by each of our speakers, trying to keep them relatively short. So we have time to address a number of different aspects of these proposed new relationships between the EU and Africa. We'll then take questions from the public. We'll hopefully have time to do that. So please do write them using the Zoom function if you're following the debate, while you're following the debate. So what is our starting point? Earlier this year, the EU proposed a draft comprehensive strategy with Africa, while the African Union, European Union summit that was meant to amend and adopt this proposed new strategy was eventually postponed to next year. The draft reflects somehow the idea of a more geopolitical European Commission, and also that Europe deems Africa a priority. Today, the delay in holding the summit that should adopt this strategy offers us an additional opportunity to better understand what this strategy is about, the meaning of what Europe is proposing, the possible implications of the proposal, and of course, reactions from Africa. Also, we will need to address what the current pandemic, what the implications of the current pandemic are in terms of what's been proposed by the EU. So I'll keep my role to a minimum, and I want to start asking the first of our speaker, Geert Laporte, what are the key contents of the EU proposal, of the EU's draft new strategy? What is new? What is different compared with respect to existing Euro-African arrangements, and what are the goals and why now?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Giovanni. I would say that, the situation with a strategy is always a bit the same. Let me start with a few sobering reflections from my side. We sometimes, I feel, pay too much attention to paper strategies. And if there is one champion in producing very nice strategies, it's definitely the European Union. We have plenty of strategies related to Europe-Africa, the Cotonou Partnership, the Joint Africa-Europe Strategy, the Juncker Alliance, there is the Global Strategy of Mogherini, and now we have this March strategy with Africa that came out just a few days before we all went into the first wave, into the first lockdown as a result of COVID-19. What I want to say with this is that words are sometimes cheap, and strategies contain a lot of shoulds and woulds and coulds. So they also sometimes become a little bit of a shopping list of priorities to please everyone. So at a certain moment, we need to look also a little bit beyond the words and beyond the various intentions. But I guess that this is what we will do also in the second part of this debate. Let me now focus particularly on what I identified in this strategy to be new. I would say on the goals, on what I would call the process, there's three elements that I feel are quite important. The first one is that there is a clear expression, a strong expression by the European Union to have a different type of partnership with Africa. And this is said several times. We are aiming for a partnership of equals. The European Union wants to move away from a donor-recipient relationship that was based on aid. We want a stronger political alliance in the global fora. So there is a strong interest from the European Union side to have a different type of relationship with Africa. Secondly, I think on process, you could also say that there is a bit more modesty and self-criticism in this strategy with Africa. Before we were talking about a strategy for Africa, now it is a strategy with Africa. And the EU also expresses in this strategy the commitment to really adapt its way in which it is engaging with Africa. So this is quite positive. And then thirdly, an element that I also found back in this strategy is that there is more reciprocity. I think for the first time, the European Union is willing to recognize that it also has problems at home, and that it also needs to comply with its part of the responsibilities in the partnership. For example, there is one quote that I would like to mention. The EU intends to step up cooperation on democratic governance and rule of law on both continents. On both continents. Before, this would be unilaterally only addressed towards Africa. Now it's on both continents. So there is an implicit recognition that we have a problem at home as well in the European Union, in countries not to name Poland, Hungary, and a few others. Now, when I look at the content is putting forward 5 key priorities: green transition and energy access, digital transformation, sustainable growth and jobs, peace and governance, and migration and mobility. And it's very hard to disagree with these key areas. What is new is definitely the green transition, comprising as well the whole climate change agenda, and also the digital transformation agenda. And overall, you could say that this strategy is shifting a little bit the balance towards more economic domains, jobs, investment, trade, connectivity, digital, energy, infrastructure. So it's shifting more the balance towards the more economic domains and a bit less towards the more political domains. Although these political domains, peace and security, governance, remains still very important, my feeling is that we are moving a little bit more into an economic type of prioritization. I think I stop here because this is the introduction, and we can come back later on how this strategy will effectively also work. Because my point that I want to make here is that it is not too difficult to find a certain convergence between African and European agendas on paper. It's much more difficult once you go into the detail. As they always say, the devil is in the detail. But I'll come back to that in the second round.
Thank you, Hert. That's very, very clear introduction. Very helpful for us. Giovanni Faleg from the European Union Institute for Security Studies. I know you have addressed the question of what are actually European Union member states doing with regard to Africa. The moment the European Union as such proposed a new strategy with or for Africa, an important issue is whether individual members are on board. What are their Africa policies? Are, say, the Africa policies of France, Germany, or Hungary sufficiently in line with what the EU is proposing? What are the key differences among individual member states in Europe? Which directions are they pushing or pulling? Giovanni, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Giovanni. And yes, we have addressed these issues in a EUISS report, which was recently published, and it's called African Strategies, European and Global Approaches Towards Sub-Saharan Africa. Pretty much like Gerd said, this strategitis, which is a very contagious phenomenon in bureaucracies of willing to make many strategies, which then prove to be quite complex to implement, is diffusing not just at the EU level, but also at the level of EU member states. So member states have stepped up engagement in Africa, and beyond traditional ones that had already historical track record of engagement like France, Italy, Germany, Belgium, many more EU member states have developed strategic approaches to intensify economic, political, and security engagement in the continent, most notably the Nordic countries or the Visegrad countries, among others. So this is something that it's happening at the EU level, and that has to be taken into account when thinking about a wide and comprehensive European Union strategies, because of course what the EU member states do has an impact on what the EU does. What we found in the report is that overall there is a broad consensus between EU member states on the priorities that Gert was mentioning of the joint communication that was released in March 2020. Also because these are relatively low-hanging fruits and things that it's commonly difficult to disagree with. In terms of geographic presence, what we found in the report is that EU member states concentrate most of their engagement in West Africa, in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. South Africa and Ethiopia remain main economic and political hubs, where most embassies are and business councils, and where we can see really the presence of EU member states. Among others, Ghana is competing in West Africa with Nigeria as the most promising emerging commercial hub. And looking ahead, there is a growing focus on the Indian Ocean, which can be expected along the topic of maritime security. Now, these are strategic considerations, and again, there's not much member state disagree on at the strategic level. But as also Gert was saying, the devil is in the detail. So here is where member states, even though speak similar strategic language, have very divergent strategic interests. So when they come to do things, here's where we can have some problems and divergence. I will mention two things that I believe are important before giving the floor to the other speakers. Now, the first one is that the growing importance of Africa for EU capitals, as well as for other global actors, what we call the new scramble for Africa, can amplify intra-EU competition for economic deals and political influence. So this is something that we expect to see not just between the European Union and global competitors, but potentially, if not mitigated, also within the European Union itself. And we can have clear example of that in West Africa and the Sahel. Overall, uncoordinated national trade and investment plans can create this mini scramble, and also the provision of security, which is subject to an oligopoly or, if not a monopoly of some member states, can create important divergences within the EU. So these are factors to be taken into account and to pay attention to. Secondly, member states have very dissimilar historic trajectories when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa. There are those with a colonial past, and they generally struggle to cancel negative perceptions. And there are others that are new players, or relatively new players, that can share experiences without prejudice attached to it, and therefore enter as proactively into the competition. So, to conclude, although in principle there is a convergence of interest, the devil is really in the detail, and if fragmentation prevails within the EU and among the 27 member states, then the whole European Union can lose ground against rising multipolar competition. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni. In the next round, I'd like you also to maybe mention some difference among specific European countries where pushing in different directions. But I'll come back to this later. Karim El-Anawi from the Policy Center of the New South. The draft new strategy that the EU proposed was assembled or pre-packaged by the EU and presented to Africans, to the African Union for negotiation, of course, on the face of it at least. But how does the EU new strategy fit Africa's own priorities? What are the issues where there are more clearly divergent views or interests between Europeans and Africans?
Thank you, Giovanni. It's a pleasure to be here again with ISPI and with the colleagues on this panel. Let me first say one at the outset a comment. First of all, I think the mindset has changed, as it was explained by Mr. Laporte particularly. And I think the mindset has changed, and I think Europe in general, of course, we are here sort of, having a sketchy sort of, discussion because, there are differences between countries. But let's say in general, the European Union has tried to come up with something that is at the level of where Africa is today, trying to understand and to take into account the outlook for the African continent as it sees it from Europe. And I think it is to be commended. And it's important that we have also a framework. Let us not, I understand from your European perspective, you both sort of mentioned the overproduction of strategies, etc. But let's not, during particularly those days, underestimate the importance of framing discussions, of being able to discuss, to exchange, to have a dialogue, with shared values. And it starts with something you put on paper, or discussions or frameworks, or the discipline of facts also, which this kind of strategies tries to achieve. So my take on that is that it's globally positive. Of course, it's a long list. Everything is a priority in a way, but that's not very important. The importance is to set up a framework where you will follow up on the progress, and you have a high quality policy dialogue year after year where you monitor the progress, etc. So my sense is, of course, the devil is in details, and let us see what's going to be done on concretely. But everybody, I think, on the continent has witnessed the change of mindset, the willingness to do things differently. Also, the internalization by the European Union of the global context, which you mentioned as being modestly a more geopolitical commission, which is basically trying to find a specific place for the European Union within the broader geopolitical dynamics and the competition or rivalry that is shaping the world in which we live, and particularly has specific dynamics in Africa, but that will be your second point. What I think has a great potential in terms of substance and content of the agreement, of the strategies, I would put at the center of the strategy and sort of the platform that could bring about lots of benefits for Africa and the European Union and the world as a whole, is basically working together toward the green transition. I think there are immense opportunities of collaboration, particularly in electrical production, out of renewable energy, and complementarities with your, particularly in the area of solar and wind, where Morocco has gained an interesting experience, but there are other countries that are doing good stuff. But I think we are ready on the technological side, ready on the price side. Now it's a political matter of converging, creating the appropriate markets and the appropriate regulatory framework. But I think this has a huge potential, and it is so important for the world as a whole. There is no way that we can have Africa develop itself with the carbon intensity we have seen since the Industrial Revolution in advanced economies. So that, for me, I think is a good intuition. It's essential, and this is something we should focus on in terms of the relation. I think human security is also important. It is the various dimensions, and particularly what we discovered with COVID, which is sort of securing the value chain, responding to demands for protection from the population in Europe in terms of their government providing basic services in health and more complex services, of course, but a sort of a secure backbone for essential products that until COVID we deemed to be easily available in Europe, and which discovered that's not necessarily the case. And in that area, redimensioning, relocalizing, having sort of joint industrial policies where we can build supply chains to provide this kind of products in the area of pharmaceutical, but not only. Electricity provision can be one too. It's too long to explain here, but it has an important security dimension as well. But there are many other products in terms of basic minerals, rare earths, etc. And I think Europe and Africa have a common sort of understanding and view of the world in this area, and particularly, of course, where I live, Morocco, but others in West Africa, Central Africa, even Eastern Africa, where it's easier to converge on norms, because this is complex to do. We get into regulatory frameworks, we get into how we regulate markets, the type of norms we have. So I think the strategy in a nutshell is a good step toward framing the dialogue, creating a platform with a new mindset, with a better understanding of where is Africa today and where is Africa's future, and European Union being part of that, wanting to be part of that sort of story, the long term in the future. But we need to get into those details and that I don't think competition between European nations, as you were mentioning, it is a big issue as soon as you create the appropriate framework and the competitive framework for, let's say, the provision of electricity, clean energy, etc.
Karim, I want to give you 2 minutes more because you sounded pretty. That's fine. You sound pretty positive. As if you haven't mentioned issues where there might be important clashes or disagreement between Africa.
I can.
So, yes, I'd like you to spend a minute or two pointing to what might be areas of friction between the two.
Yes, Giovanni, but I believe in path dependency and virtual circles. The important is the first step to put us on a virtual path together. There are many difficult topics. There will be always many difficult topics. Of course, migration is one that can be, seriously difficult. But my sense is that we have more positive, things to do together. They are, and particularly around, the greening our economies, at every level, which is a mankind challenge, and where Africa and Europe have a particular role and specific role to play. I didn't mention also the necessity in aging populations to recycle your savings to have net positive returns in an area of largely available money, around the world, created by central banks because of the crisis we had over the past 10, 12 years. And that positive returns are where there are the highest rates of growth, which is Africa. So we need to see how we can reinvest that, greening African economies, greening, electricity provision, the production of goods, etc., for Europe.
Okay, thank you, Karim. We might come back to this later. Thanks. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I think I was
you was muted.
I was muted by somebody else. Paul Simon Handy from the Institute for Security Studies. Carrie mentioned broadly what Africa's perspective on this proposed new strategy could be. Can you help us understand whether there might be differences among African countries in approaching the kind of proposals that the EU made? So to what extent is there a common position, and to what extent there are differences among African countries? Oh, Simon.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. And yes, I think we need to be clear on the fact that Africa doesn't speak with one voice. Africa doesn't have African countries don't have a common position. Although there are efforts to have a common agenda when dealing with Europe. Let me shortly explain why. I mean, there are obvious reasons, 54 countries of different sizes, various economic and political stability. I mean, the EU with 27 members knows it quite well how difficult it is to create consensus. And in Africa, in an even bigger framework. Countries have various interests and even divergences when it comes to the structure of the economies, for example. Negotiations of the economic partnership agreement were a good reminder of African countries' competing interests, and that the EU was also very good at exploiting at that time. But there have been some noticeable efforts towards crafting and designing a common African agenda based on some values and principles that are supposed to be shared by African countries. But what Africa lacks mostly is a proper architecture, a division of labor between the various actors who have a say in the EU-Africa relations. These are the member states, the regional economic communities, the AU, and the ACP Secretariat. The current negotiations for a post-Cotonou agreement have outlined this lack of clearly defined roles because, of course, the AU wanted to have a more prominent role, and the ACP Secretariat, of course, was fighting for survival. But another reason why Africa also doesn't have a common position also relates to the EU, to the European Union itself. The EU structures Africa, particularly in the Cotonou Agreement, but also within the structures of its external action, in a way that actually divides the continent in various spaces and regions that do not align with the way Africa structures itself. In a nutshell, there's North Africa with a specific type of policies, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Africa. Yes, there has been change with the joint EU-Africa strategy, changed that perspective because for the first time, the European Union was actually looking at Africa as a whole. But the main structures of the EU-Africa policy still reflect that division. And the EU has also created some incentives that favor the maintenance of that status quo. And lastly, I want to mention the fact that the EU as a foreign policy actor has a tremendous immaterial power, material power in any case, but also immaterial power when dealing with African countries at all levels, at the member state levels, in Addis Ababa with the AU Commission and the Peace and Security Council, and in Brussels with the ACP Secretariat. So the EU appears in various forms, and it therefore has a substantial comparative advantage that creates incentives also for countries, for African countries, to maximize their interest at the national level, sometimes to the detriment of regional goals. So this is, in a nutshell, I would say, why it has been so far difficult for Africa to speak with one voice when dealing with the European Union. Over.
Thank you, Paul Simon. Thank you. So this was a very, very, very fruitful first round. I want to go back to Gert and ask him about what is the likely impact of the proposed strategy the day it would be implemented. What kind of changes would it produce if adopted? And what is needed for such a strategy to actually work and be successfully implemented? Because as we heard, it's a very ambitious plan.
Yes, Giovanni, very good questions. I would like to start with raising a few elements that point to initial progress, because if we would have had this meeting a few months ago, I would have been hesitant in a number of ways to put forward these elements of progress. But I would like to highlight these, and then I will go into a few areas where there is still major divergence and where there is quite some work to be done to build the necessary convergence, the necessary consensus. On progress, I tend to agree to some extent also with what Karim said. I think at this moment, we see a few promising areas of progress. The first one that I would like to mention is the fact that there has been quite some high-level action and interest. Von der Leyen went just after she has been nominated as President of the European Commission. She went immediately to Addis. Michel attended the African Union summit. We've had the commission-to-commission meeting with 22 commissioners from the European side. This is a clear expression of high-level commitment. Secondly, those who follow a little bit the financing for development know that we will have a neighborhood and development cooperation instrument, the so-called NDICI. In my view, that's also a step forward. And this was adopted by the heads of state, and now pending on the endorsement and approval by the European Parliament, we will have one single instrument that will be much more flexible, more coherent, and it will break away from what I would call the instruments that have really created many decades of vested interest, not to name the European Development Fund in the Cotonou Partnership Agreement, in the Lomé Conventions of the past, which in my view is really a type of cooperation, post-colonial cooperation of the past, where it is a pity that the European Union and the ACP countries, the African countries in CASU, have not get rid of this. But in any case, it is just a matter of time, and we will move towards different types of partnerships, although the negotiations are now so advanced that we will probably have a new post-Cotonou agreement. But it will be under different conditions with different financing modalities. Another element that I would like to mention is that many EU member states, and it was already mentioned by Giovanni Falek, many EU member states have adopted Africa policies and Africa strategies. I'm just mentioning countries like Estonia. They hardly had any type of relationship with Africa. They now have national Africa strategies. And it's not the only country. There's several European member states, so-called new Eastern European, Central European member states that take an interest in Africa. And last point, very important, Europe and Africa talk a lot about alliance building in multilateral fora. And sometimes this is a bit hollow, but this week we have seen that there is also some progress to be registered there. The European Union has supported the Nigerian candidate for the WTO, Mrs. Ngozi Okonjo. I know that this has really costed a lot of energy of the European President, Michel, because there were a number of European member states who wanted to back up the Korean candidate, but finally Europe had a collective joint position to back up the African candidate. These are positive signs, but there's still a long way to go, and there's still a number of issues where there is major friction, you could call it, divergence. And just to mention the area that was raised by Karim, the greening of the economies, it's a priority of both continents, no doubt. Both in Africa and in Europe, it is a very important priority. But there is, of course, a big worry in Africa that this could lead to a new type of protectionism, that the Green Deal will impose new non-tariff barriers to Africa, not to name the carbon tax, new environmental standards, and so on. So these are some of the issues that need to be sorted out. Another one is migration and mobility. We know the issues. Europe wants to control its borders and wants to impose a forced return of refugees to Africa, while Africa is arguing in favor of more labor mobility and more legal pathways towards Europe. On governance, we have major divergences, as we also see in the Cotonou negotiations at this very moment, issues like the LGBTI rights, ICC, the shrinking space of civil society in a number of countries, free media. So there's quite some work to be done in these areas. And I think that maybe another area that I forgot to mention, the very important Africa continental free trade area, and the way in which EPAs could be a stumbling block or could be a facilitating factor towards this Africa continental free trade area. Also, this is an area of tension and divergence. What I want to say to conclude is that we are in a situation that we need to invest more in sorting out these divergences, but this will depend very much on the way the balance of power between the two continents will evolve. And for me, it is obvious that an aid donor-recipient related partnership that has been there for so many decades is a stumbling block to have a more balanced partnership between the two groups of countries. And so there is work to be done to break these vested interests created by the aid relationship, to break the dependency relationship. So that's absolutely a top priority between both continents. And secondly, internally within the European Union, there is more work to be done to really make the European Union a geopolitical power. We see that the tensions between the member states and the Brussels institutions are still there, and the European Union will be as strong as its member states allow it to be. So we need to have major steps put forward towards a common European foreign policy. And this is, of course, a very distant dream. But in this current context, I think Europe has no other choice than to speed up that process. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerrit, for this last point of yours. This is very much something that I wanted, that I want Giovanni Falek to come on to. What can European member states do in their individual approaches to Africa to improve the chances of success of the new strategy? How can the harmony, let's say, the coherence, the consistency of individual member states' approaches to Africa be improved, so to strengthen overall the European approach to Africa?
Thank you, Giovanni. And just to clarify one point I made before, I was talking about this strategitis of EU member states with regards to Africa. Now, this phenomenon per se, and I think Karim also pointed to that, is a good thing. I mean, it means that Africa is more relevant for more EU member states. Now, that per se is a positive development. So a strategic relevance that can, in theory, do good to the relationship between the two continents. Now, the tricky thing comes, how do you make use of this strategic relevance and which policy action follow in the pursuit of national interest? I'll give you one example. Summits, the art of summits. Now, we know that global powers in many instances are organizing high-level summits with African leaders to get economic deals and seal relationships and partnerships for the future. Now, imagine if you are an African country, imagine you are Angola, and you get invited to the Chinese summit and to the Japanese summit and to Russia. And then you get 27 invitations from the EU. You know, it's a little bit of the same problem we had with the phone call for, you know, the EU's foreign ministry, which is now partly solved. Now, the risk we have in the European Union is to bring coherence in those diversified strategic approaches among EU member states. Now, this is not impossible, and I think there is good progress in the right direction being done by the current EU leadership, but it will take additional leadership efforts in the future to bring consistency as the theme of Europe-Africa relations become more relevant in EU member states. And this can mean, harmonizing positions between, as I said, the traditional member states that were engaged in Africa, such as France or Italy or Spain or Germany, and those who are in a way newcomers, but still nonetheless can have an interest in securing good deals or expanding their influence. And here we can talk about Hungary, we can talk about Poland, Czech Republic, Malta has developed a new Africa strategy. Estonia was mentioned by Gert beforehand. So bringing consistency in these new dynamics, also within the EU, will take a lot of top-down EU leadership, a lot of efforts from the EU and the EAS and the other institutions and the Commission to make sure that interests and orientations align. Now, how to do that? I think there are two dimensions that are very important. First, when you talk about harmonizing strategies, it is paramount to understand what Africans demand. And this is something that also Paul Simon was mentioning before. So rethinking Europe's geopolitical orientations in line with new African dynamics. And this is an effort that has to be done by the EU, dragging and pushing EU member states to go in the same direction, having a common position. So the continental free trade area, Gert mentioned it, creates a need to relink North and Sub-Saharan Africa. This should be done also at the level of European member states and EU policymaking to do this relink in strategic planning. Also going past the ARCOM stability paradigm, these areas stretching from the Sahel to the Horn of Africa, going beyond that, it's very important as violent extremism expands to other parts of Africa, for instance, in DRC and Mozambique. So this is also another geopolitical space that should be rethought. And also provide value added and EU supports in areas that are in dire need of policy attention, such as urbanization and digital transformation. So these are decisive areas, for instance, if we think about conflict prevention, what can happen in the urban space in terms of future conflicts. Now here, top-down in the sense EU leadership to build consensual position among EU member states will be decisive. But there's also another dimension, and with that I will conclude. It's to foster cooperative approaches with other global partners, aligning EU and other actors' strategies. So the contribution that the European Union can do in terms of reinforcing multilateralism towards Africa, and I think Gert mentioned it very rightly beforehand, can also harmonize the positions among EU member states themselves. Some examples. First, there is definitely a need to follow an alignment strategy with the United Kingdom. UK, despite Brexit, is a state with which there is great convergence in terms of values, interests, and objectives and narratives when it comes to Africa, relations with Africa. There is also a need to foster stronger strategic and commercial links in the Indian Ocean. And here there can be good cooperation that can be established with partners like Japan and India, and also with African countries. And this is an effort in which the European Union and the member states can follow similar trajectories. And then, as Gert also mentioned, the continental free trade area, here it is very important to establish a new trade dialogue between Europe and Africa, which is oriented to support the CFTA and also start talking about a continent-to-continent trade agreement between Europe and Africa. This is something that requires a discussion between all the actors involved, and certainly requires an underlying agreement between EU member states. But of course, the beneficial that you can get in having harmonized position on a topic like trade are way better than the cost of seeking trade deals one by one and in a climate that is characterized by growing geopolitical competition. And I think that by fostering these cooperative approaches, then, as Gert was saying, we can have chances to revamp multilateralism also globally through a deeper and better relationship between European Union and African partners. And I'll conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni. It's very interesting that you mentioned non-European international partners of Africa, and I would like Karim to comment on this. We know very well that over the past, say, 15 years to 20 years, a number of new partners, or partners that returned to Africa, gained influence over the continent. China, there's been plenty of talk about it, but also you mentioned India, you mentioned Japan, Turkey, the Gulf states, and there's so many potential partners today, many more potential partners today for African countries compared to some time back. How does that affect the way Africans look at Europe and the way and what Africans expect from Europeans?
Well, that's a difficult question. What I can tell you is that, well, maybe I'm not qualified to answer, but let me try to give you more an intuition. My first intuition is that it's simply that Africa is now part of the world. These dynamics have to be looked into a historical perspective, and particularly after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We are now in a sort of really stepping in a different world. And Africa has many partners. I think what we lived before was a sort of exceptional period of sort of an Africa that was in a way divided by the two blocks, and colonial relations were sort of quasi-exclusive, or to be seen as part of those two blocks. So now it's a more open world. You have middle powers. You mentioned some of them: Turkey, the Gulf states, a couple of countries in Latin America, but less so. But some of them, of course, Europe, the US, China, everybody. Africa has relations with everybody, and I think everybody, people perceive that the potential, the growth potential of Africa of the next 50 years is basically, on average, if everything goes well, the right policies, etc., it's could be China's path over the past 50 years. That's with greening our economies. That's the engine of growth for the world economy for the next 50 years. But we have to do it much better, less carbonized, less carbon intensity. Otherwise, in a way, we're all dead. So it's a matter of life and death, So that's where I can see Europe has a specific relation with Africa, and it was mentioned by our speaker, by Paul Simon earlier on. There is a specific place for Europe for many reasons. That is not necessarily completely well integrated by the European Union in a way. We have to understand why. But there is a specific, and I would say in general positive, despite the past in some specific countries, history, etc. But on average, there is a sort of trust, a sort of capital of trust. So we don't have time to explain, but I think this is there, and this should be put to use. If I can say something, and that will be my last words, is that we need to experiment more. I think this relation shouldn't be only in the hand of civil servants on both continents. It needs to give more space to civil society, of course, to think tanks, to university, to academia. so we can experiment. We don't have to solve all the problems now. We have to escape the anxiety of complexity, of aligning and having a consensus of I don't know, about 80 countries. We need to experiment on. It should be coalitions of countries that want to experiment common markets and joint common single regulatory frameworks to produce and trade, renewable energy. Technology should flow more easily within continents. I don't think we fear the sort of carbon tax. I don't think it will be a mistake to look at the Green Deal this way. And so we need to multiply dialogue. We need to intensify exchanges and dialogues. And this will bring about a positive evolution, because I think we share a mindset and the trusts and in a way. So that would be my recommendation. The strategy is good, but let's provide frameworks and spaces where we can multiply the exchange, intensify exchange and dialogues to understand each other and experiment, to give more space to experimentations and the possibility of things to happen, and particularly using Africa's energy, which the main energy of Africa, it's its young population. It's not, of course, what is mineral or oil and gas or whatever. And that's what is lacking also Europe, aging population and demography. So I think we need to, politicians should also think, do we leave enough space for things to happen? Let's not confiscate all the space. Public policy is also about experimentation, trying and failing. There is no problem. Let's try things on migration. We don't have to have a one-size-fits-all that perfectly works migration policy from day one. We need to experiment, and we need to accept that, and we need to have the possibility to do that. So that's also something I wanted to share with you. It is also a new spirit, a new mindset, maybe, in the kind of relations we are having. And I think it's possible between Africa and Europe. It's not necessarily possible between other blocks. And I think it is one of the reasons why the European Union has been a project that is still there, 70 years later. And I think this is a great lesson of the capacity of Europe to solve its very difficult problems in a very original way, which I think Africa has some of it. And you've seen also the African Union and the fact that most African countries are very proud of this institution, that we need to continue to invest in it. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Karim. You stressed the need for using a multiplicity of routes, ways of experimenting by involving several different actors. You mentioned civil society actors, and so on. So I want to ask Paul Simon, in all this, what do you think can be the role of the African Union, on the other hand, which is also a point Karim touched upon, as a unified negotiating actor, as a single voice for the continent? What point has it reached, the African Union, in terms of being able to talk to and negotiate with the European Union on behalf of the continent?
Thank you for that question. What is clear is that for matters relating to the EU-Africa strategy, the African Union is supposed to be the main interlocutor. But maybe before I come to that, let me just maybe mention a small concern that I have related to the EU-Africa strategy, and the fact that and a problem that has been appearing for the last 15 years since the first iteration of the EU-Africa strategy. I mean, the EU proposed strategy. I think the inherent asymmetry of EU-Africa relations pushes very often the EU to set the agenda and Africa to react to the EU's proposition, which, in my view, is already a problem. And I cannot blame the EU for that. I actually blame the African Union. You guys are complaining about a flurry of strategies. We are actually complaining about the exact opposite, lack of strategies, a dearth actually of frameworks. I would like to see an African Union Europe strategy. I would like to see a strategy of for Europe in Africa's major countries. And some major countries are, for example, the main contributors in the budget of the African Union. So very often, African countries have reacted to an agenda that has been set by the EU, topics that have been set by the EU, and now discussions are actually centered around those. But to be fair to the EU Commission, it does not yet have a clearly articulated mandate to set such an agenda. But maybe the EU should also not wait for member states to give it, should maybe propose as well. That's the difference between a commission and the Secretariat General. So, but we know that even the process of articulating the first EU-Africa strategy was launched in 2005 at the initiative of the EU Commission, which drafted a strategy that the Council adopted later, but then African countries complained that this strategy had a European bias, and thereafter a joint strategy had emerged. So as far as the AU and its capacity to develop a strategy are concerned, I think there's a will, and there's also increasingly a political will to do so. The AU has defined in 2018 some priorities regarding what Africa's main issues should be in the negotiations with the European Union. And I think those priorities just take into account the fact that Africa is a continent in transition, facing many transitions. Many of them have already been mentioned by colleagues here in this panel. And so Africa deals with major structural issues, and partnerships with external actors, including the European Union, which is certainly the most important so far, have to actually help Africa navigate the complex waters of development while building states in a context that is aggravated by COVID, actually. So, but we have to take into account that these negotiations, beyond the political correct and diplomatic discourses, these negotiations are a manifestation of power as well. And the EU has actually moved ahead by setting the agenda and the scene. The AU now has to come forth, but the process of developing those priorities within the AU is a complex one. It's not clearly articulated as now, so there's still a lot for the African Union to come up with a process that is not only consensual, but that's also inclusive and brings in various voices to define a common position. It's still there's still a long way to go, in my view, but the AU Commission is getting there. You shouldn't forget that the AU Commission does not have a mandate, for example, for external action for foreign policy. So the AU is trying to find its way in these extreme, complex water, and is discovering itself also as a negotiator in international relations. So I think for these strategy, we want to see a very strong role of the EU Commission, but maybe for the next strategy, we'll probably have better oil structures with a Commission more capacitated to actually be a stronger interlocutor for the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul Simon. We've run out of time, but I just want to spend our last very few minutes to address one issue that has remained there. The greatest challenge that the new strategy actually does not address is COVID-19. And that's because, of course, it was proposed essentially prior to the arrival or at the moment when the pandemic hit Europe and then also Africa. Do you think that the current pandemic will have an impact in reconsidering, adapting the draft strategy as it has been proposed by the EU? And if so, in which direction? How do you think that COVID-19 will affect these negotiations between the EU and Africa? I'd like a couple of you to come and comment on this point, please.
Shall I start quickly?
Yes, Gerd, please.
Well, Giovanni, I think, of course, there's one element that was totally left out in this strategy. There was pandemic and health, so the implications could not be predicted in a strategy that was out before the COVID-19 crisis. But basically, I think that there should not be any misunderstanding. Both Europe and Africa are both suffering, of course, from the economic consequences. Europe much more even from the health consequences of this crisis. So global solidarity will absolutely be needed in a post-COVID period. And Europe can show that global solidarity by actions such as debt relief, aid, and so on. But this should only be a temporary solution. I think beyond that, we should really seize this crisis as an opportunity to undertake structural reforms and to really experiment, as Karim has also said. And one of the ways of experimenting is that we should indeed make use of this crisis to do a number of structural governance reforms. Because if there is one dimension that has been left out, I think in the recent times in the Europe-Africa partnership, then it is definitely the governance dimension. I think we should restore it. We need effective and accountable states, not only in Africa. No, we need it in Europe. We need it in the US. We need effective states. And I think this is the moment to invest in this. And on the African side, it could lead to maybe less dependency on European and other aid flows by, for example, doing structural reforms of the taxation systems, the domestic resource mobilization systems, together with Europe tackling the illicit financial flows. And of course, an element, last but not least, that was mentioned by Karim, moving towards a mix of other actors that have not yet been fully part of this partnership Europe-Africa. And then I'm talking, of course, about civil society organizations, think tanks, a whole range of private sector, business, and other actors. I think these are the opportunities that we should seize, and every crisis provides opportunities. So let's hope that these will be seized by the different partners.
Thank you, Gerd. Giovanni, Paul Simon, Karim, anybody who wants to add comments on the COVID question?
Yeah, maybe quickly, Giovanni, and to conclude, well, the first implication is probably no handshakes for the EU-AU summit, which has been postponed. So unfortunately, some immediate implication in terms of the ability of leaders from the two continents to discuss important matters. But going into deeper and more important things, I feel that COVID accelerates dramatically pre-existing trends. This is the most important impact beyond the health consequences of the pandemic, is that everything that we imagined as longer term developments with COVID can be subject to an acceleration, in some cases for the good, in some cases for the worse. And if we think, for instance, about also phenomena such as violent extremism, it also expanded and accelerated in a very dangerous and concerning way due to COVID. So I think that from the policymakers' standpoint, from both continents, there is a imperative to be ready to face and tackle that acceleration of trends, because as in many policy areas, we may witness the need for progress that is faster than our ability to think, plan, and act for it. So I think time is of the essence, and a closer relationship in the action that leaders from the two continents can put on the table, I think it will be a very important factor. So unfortunately, no ability to do the handshakes this fall for the EU-IU summit, but as soon as possible, in whatever format, whether virtual or in person, it is paramount that the objective of building resilience, as Gerd was saying, it is met and addressed as soon as possible.
Thank you, Giovanni. Karim and Paul Simon, do you want to add anything to this? Oh.
Just one word. I think COVID will have to be factored in, definitely, for the reasons that Gerd just mentioned, as well as Giovanni, of course. I just want to mention the aspect, of course, of governance, because if there's one thing that the crisis has actually made us aware of, paradoxically, is how important the building of reliable and strong states is. We need states, and not just for public health matters, but also for security issues. And the crisis, the COVID crisis, has exposed some vulnerabilities, and at some point even accelerated them. But I think that moving forward, because Europe and Africa has been seriously hit economically, they will have to factor that in, because even Europe's ability to provide some funding will dry up, and African countries will have to make some additional plans. So I think probably when the strategy is released, COVID will have a much stronger position in it than assumed before. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul Simon. So let me conclude by saying that 2020 was said by many to be a crucial year for European-African relations, because the post-Cotonou deal was meant to be achieved and signed, and because of the new strategy that the European Commission drafted. In fact, we are fast approaching the end of 2020 without probably either of them being completed, achieved. So it's now going to be possibly 2021, which is going to be an important year for the evolution of relations between the two areas. And I'm thus looking forward to having new opportunities to discuss with the four of you what direction these relations will take. So I thank you very much for taking part and contributing to this very rich discussion. And I'm looking forward again to having you in our next roundtables. Thank you.
Thank you, Jovan.